almost no other topic is more pressing than the one that we're going to hear more about today, which is how to deal with the European sovereign debt crisis, which solutions to follow. And I think I can also say that no speaker would be better qualified to speak about this topic than our guest of honor, Dr. Dombret, today, who will take a closer look at where we stand and what are the solutions that we will see over the next weeks, months, and years. So what is the future? Where do we go? I'd just like to quote a couple of words Dr. Dombret recently gave in an interview in the Wirtschaftswoche, just highlighting some of the aspects that are important in his view to get over the crisis. For example, the shadow banking system needs to be better monitored and regulated. The regulation of cross-border trading and over-the-counter derivatives needs to be rigorously pursued, and a compelling solution finally needs to be found for the too big to fail issue with respect to large systemically important banks. So all very important topics. So in that sense, I'm more than delighted to welcome Dr. Dombret and to hear firsthand about this and other initiatives. Just a few words to introduce Dr. Dombret. He has been a member of the executive board of the Deutsche Bundesbank since 2010, in charge of financial stability, statistics, and risk control. And furthermore, and I think this is also very important and makes him particularly suited to discuss this topic, he has also had a distinguished career in the private banking industry, for example, working for Bank of America, Rothschild, JP Morgan, and Deutsche Bank. Dr. Dombret earned his doctorate at the Friedrich-Alexander University of Erlangen-Nürnberg, and he has also been an honorary professor at the European Business School in Österreich-Winkel. And I should also mention beyond this, he was awarded the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany. This was in 2007, and the Austrian Cross of Honor for Science and Art just last year, in fact, last fall. So in that sense, it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Dombret. I'd also like to introduce our moderator for today, Moritz Döbler, business editor at the Tagesspiegel, who will later on lead through the discussion, and then will also invite you to have your questions ready, your comments on this. I'd also like to thank the Tagesspiegel for the support as our media partner here. But first of all, and most importantly, to our guest of honor, Dr. Dombret, the floor is yours.
Dear Professor Rocholl, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here. I have to say that I am quite sick. One could say systemically sick. I caught a very bad cold while being at the G20 in Moscow, so in action sort of last week. And so I'm not feeling very well, and I'm going to open this bottle first of all. And I'm very delighted to be here. I know that Mr. Rocholl has asked already twice or three times, and I'm glad that this works out by now on a snowy day in Berlin. Why is the ESMT important? First of all, you said I was honorary professor at the European Business School. I actually am honorary professor at the European Business School, but that is also a private university. And that's why I'm always happy to come to universities, first of all, but also to private universities. Because when you took the decision here in Berlin to set up a private business school, at a time when the academic landscape was almost entirely public, or dominated by public institutions, I remember very well that this was met with a high degree of skepticism at the time. And in this regard, if you want, the ESMT was no different to any other startup. But 10 years later, your university is doing rather well, and that is much less common among startups, I must say. Failure rates are high among young enterprises, but whenever the initial phase has been survived, a long period normally of robust health is to be expected for young enterprises. So optimism is warranted in the case of the ESMT, and not just because you are entering its teens and you have become a teenager. One of your main fields of study is in European competitiveness. And I thought that I'll talk a little bit about competitiveness. The results of your research because competitiveness is so important, will hardly suffer from a lack of attention these days. It is now widely agreed upon that persistent gaps in competitiveness were one of the root causes of the current crisis in the Eurozone. And recognizing that fact certainly constitutes already progress, because up to now, not many people were willing to recognize that. Nevertheless, although a consensus appears to have emerged concerning how the crisis developed, so there's a consensus how the crisis developed, views still differ very much on how the crisis should be resolved. Very, very, very often one cannot even agree how the crisis developed. I think it's a very, very broad agreement on how it came about. But that's why, although everybody agrees uniformly where this crisis has come from and why it has evolved, the recipes are very, very, very different how to cure it, which is quite unusual. And I think that this seems somewhat paradoxical, at least at first. If there really is a consensus that restoring competitiveness is key to overcoming the crisis, how is it that prescriptions for the euro area differ so wildly and so starkly? In my following remarks, I wish to argue that such differences of opinion have their origin largely in a constant tug of war, Tauziehen in German, tug of war, between two competing economic objectives. Efficiency, in particular motivated by the proper incentives on the one hand, and distributional issues on the other hand. Let me explain. Or to put it more bluntly, one line of argument has to do with how the European Monetary Union's growth engine should be fixed and how it should be made to run more reliably, while the other line of argument is more about who is going to foot the bill, who is going to pay for that, for past and for future burdens alike. I do not want to disregard concerns about the scale of such burdens, and I also do not want to disregard the social and political costs of bearing them. Rather, based on a diagnosis of how the crisis came about, I'd like to stress that if the European Monetary Union is not given sound foundations allowing it to function better in the future, the objectives of equity and redistribution will become self-defeating because there will be much less available to distribute. The trade-off between equity and efficiency is at the center of the debate at the national level. For example, labor market reforms in the countries at the periphery of the euro area, designed to lower barriers to entry and hence to promote employment, are being called into question now by the incumbent employees who fear downward pressures on wages and a higher risk of being made redundant in their countries. And this trade-off is at the center of the debate of the European level. On the one hand, there is the desire to strengthen incentives and to strengthen controls in order to contain risks. And on the other hand, there is the desire to share the large economic, social, and political burdens through mutualizing risks. There was a similar tug of war between sound incentives and increased burden sharing in a debate on how the rescue mechanism should be constructed, in the debate on the introduction of the Eurobonds, as well as in the debate on a true fiscal union, and it also shaped the debate on banking union. This tug of war between equity and efficiency is in all of the debate we are having right now. Another case in point concerning the tug of war between sound incentives and burden sharing is the debate on the role Germany should play in rebalancing the euro area. For sharing the burden of macroeconomic adjustment, commentators, very prominent commentators such as Martin Wolf and Paul Krugman, have suggested that Germany should lower its competitiveness, say by means of a considerable hike in wages. In other words, a larger increase than it is warranted by conditions on the German labor market. The idea behind this argument is that competitiveness is relative. One country's loss is another country's gain. That's the idea of this argument. Unfortunately, according to our own calculations, our estimates, the results of such a policy would be likely to disappoint, to say the least. We assumed an additional wage increase in Germany of 2 percentage points, above what would normally be expected as the outcome of bargaining. Then we used our economic models to calculate the effect that such an increase would have on the exports of peripheral euro area countries. Owing to the nature of the trade flows between Germany and Southern Europe, the effect would be close to non-existent, actually. Only Ireland could expect a rather moderate lift. By contrast, and no other country would have any lift whatsoever, only Germany's economy would take quite a hit. Depending on the model, employment would ultimately fall as much as 1% and output would fall by 0.75%. There would be, and that's the message, no free lunch in terms of higher German purchasing power and higher exports of deficit countries. In the case of macroeconomic adjustment, burden sharing through wage rises in Germany would be truly self-defeating. The same applies to a further fiscal stimulus in Germany. In a globalized economy, and we're living in a globalized economy, any attempt to shield one European country from competition by lowering the competitiveness of another would be doomed to fail. Would be also interested to hear what the professors of the ESMT say about that. A lasting resolution of the crisis will be achieved only by harnessing the forces of the market, not by doing away with the forces of the market. This is not only true for the euro area, but it's also true for the European Union as a whole. This very aspect of Prime Minister Cameron's so much discussed speech on Europe has received comparatively little attention, but I would like and I would wish to second Prime Minister Cameron on this very point he made. Harnessing the forces of the market for Europe as a whole means making the most of its main catalyst for competition and growth. Bringing the single market into line, for example, with the digital age, and extending it to the entire range of services available within the European Union would harbor the potential for even surpassing the gains already achieved by the single market. In this respect, in his report to the European Commission, then Commissioner Monti, now Prime Minister Monti, but then Commissioner Monti estimated the potential growth effects of creating a digital single market to be about 4%, on a par with the gains made since 1993. Further benefits would ensue from a reduction in the vast number of exemptions in the single market for services. Even if it were not for the biggest economic crisis in post-war European history, it would be, I think, it would be a shame not to tap into this reservoir. But under the current circumstances, it is even more imperative to make full use of the potential of the single market. Reforms in this area could provide a much-needed boost to the monetary union as well. In other areas, progress is also visible. The process of macroeconomic rebalancing through structural reform is well underway. The current account deficits of Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Italy are shrinking. And, as I may remind you, Ireland is already in a surplus. Even more importantly, adjustment is being accomplished not only by shrinking imports, but also by growing exports. Now, obviously, taking the route of structural reform is steep and challenging, but upwards is the direction we should aim for, and we should not deviate from that course. Harnessing the forces of the market, let me say that again, through structural reform is the right strategy for regaining competitiveness at national levels. By the same token, I am convinced that restoring market mechanisms where they have so far been impeded is crucial for strengthening the euro area's institutional framework as well. A constitutive element of any functioning market economy is the principle of liability. If I may, in this university, I would like to quote Walter Eucken, because Walter Eucken did put it as follows, and I quote, "He who profits must also bear the losses," end of quote. Very wise. When it comes to two of the biggest economic actors in the monetary union, in our monetary union, this principle only applies to a limited extent. Who are the two biggest actors in our monetary union? They are the banks and they are the sovereigns. Banks and sovereigns being a priori deemed systemically important, this is why they are so important, would not bode well for the future stability of the monetary union. A framework in which two of the biggest players are at least partially exempt from the disciplining forces of the market would invite future aberrations and would lack resilience. If we are to put our monetary union on a sounder footing, such vulnerabilities need to be addressed, and I think they need to be addressed as a matter of urgency. And as both problems are so closely intertwined, any attempt to tackle one of them in isolation would be likely to fall short of what is required. Let me please first take a step back and look at why the close link between banks and sovereigns has proved to be so problematic in this crisis. If many banks get into trouble at the same time, possibly because of a large asset bubble bursting, as we saw it in the United States, financial stability as a whole is put at risk. The government then often has no option but to step in if it wants to prevent a meltdown of the real economy. But such a rescue rewards excessive risk-taking and can place a huge strain on government finances, which is exactly what happened, for example, in Ireland, where the need to support the financial system pushed the deficit above 30% of GDP in 2010. You didn't hear wrong, 30%, above 30%. Conversely, weak government positions can destabilize banks, either directly through their exposure to sovereign bonds, or indirectly, I should say, or indirectly through worsening macroeconomic conditions. Now, breaking the link between banks and sovereigns is ever so much important for making the euro area more stable. This brings me to the topic of a banking union. And a banking union can, what I think, be a big step in that direction. But, if I may say, we need to harness the disciplinary forces of the market, not do away with them. Core elements of a comprehensive banking union therefore have to be not just an effective single supervisory mechanism, but also a comprehensive bail-in of bank creditors and a cap on exposure to individual sovereigns, as well as an adequate risk weighting of sovereign bonds on banks' balance sheets, at least in the medium term. Let me elaborate slightly on these points. In order to minimize the risks posed by bank rescues, creditors have to be first in line. Creditors have to be first in line when it comes to bearing banks' losses, and nobody else. It has to be the creditors. Implicit guarantees have to be removed. As taxpayers, money can only be the last resort. Taxpayers have to be last, not first. By the same token, with regard to the adequacy of capital buffers, sovereign bonds need to be adequately risk-weighted. Riskier bonds have to become more expensive in terms of the amount of equity they tie down, as, by the way, is already the case for non-sovereign bonds, and is widely expected the case for non-sovereign bonds. This serves mainly two purposes. Firstly, such surcharges are designed to curb elevated demand and hence bring spreads more into line with the underlying risk, thus giving a very important disciplining effect and signal to the respective sovereign. The more solid your budgetary policy is, the less spread you will pay, and obviously the other way around. And secondly, banks would become more resilient in cases of a market turmoil. The former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, Mr. Rogoff, even went so far as to state in an interview recently that adequate risk weighting of sovereign bonds constitutes a far more effective debt brake than the mechanisms envisaged in the fiscal compact. Furthermore, there should be, and I said that, there should be caps on the maximum exposure of banks to individual sovereign creditors, to individual countries, as is already the case for private creditors. Banks cannot lend unconditionally in every amount to private banks. Why can't they unconditionally lend to sovereigns? Such a step is especially important in terms of reducing the systemic importance of any individual sovereign, as Professor Rocholl pointed out in a Handelsblatt article two weeks ago, which I read very carefully. Now, a banking union will contribute to financial stability, but its design needs to preserve sound incentives for all actors involved. This is true not only for future risks, but also of risks that have already materialized. After all, a banking union is also, or you can compare a banking union to an insurance mechanism. And as with any insurance, only loss and damage that is unknown ex ante should be covered. Otherwise, you have to show me an insurance which will insure me for known losses in the future. Therefore, legacy assets, as they are called, legacy assets, in other words, those risks which evolved under the responsibility of national supervisors before the banking union was in place, have to be dealt with by the relevant member states and should not be dealt by the group. Anything else would amount to a fiscal transfer. It may be that such fiscal transfers are wanted, are desirable, or they even deemed necessary. But if so, if you want to have fiscal transfers, they should be conducted through national budgets, and they should be subject to the approval of national parliaments, rather than introduced under the disguise of a banking union, which would then have to start out under a very, very heavy burden, or for that matter, through central banks. And in the event of such transfers, the proper sequencing of events is very important, is crucial. We should not end up in a world where risks arising from banks' balance sheets are rapidly mutualized, while an effective single supervisory mechanism may be slow in coming. Now, getting the single supervisory mechanism and a common resolution and restructuring regime operational is very important. Several conceptual questions still need a convincing answer. How do we deal with the 10 EU members that do not belong to the euro area? How do we ensure the effective separation of monetary policy and bank supervision? You can see the devil is always in the detail. But I firmly believe that Europe has to get this project right and that it cannot afford to get off to a bumpy start. A banking union will not be a quick fix for the current crisis, but it is a major milestone on the road to a more stable and prosperous monetary union, and hence it is instrumental in restoring confidence in the euro area And this is the reason why I support it and why we need to get it right. Ladies and gentlemen, the European debt crisis is heading into its 4th year, and there is still some risk that it will remain on everybody's mind for some time to come, and for many students and professors to study and write about. But especially with regard to the macroeconomic rebalancing on the euro area, many signs point to a silver lining. Restoring market mechanisms through structural reform is starting to pay dividends at national level, and this approach should also guide us when addressing the remaining weaknesses in the euro area's architecture. Asserting the principle of liability, Walter Eucken, is key to breaking the negative feedback loop between banks and sovereigns. Now, the task is daunting, it is often tedious, and sometimes it's also quite sobering and very unsexy, but I'm convinced that the task can be done, and I'm very convinced that the euro's best days are still ahead of us. Thanks for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for your insights. A lot of thought, a lot of issues that we can discuss later. You made one point, there's no free lunch. Obviously that's true, but there's one thing that's free today, that's the newspaper that's right over there, just in case you didn't notice. We're a very proud partner to be, we're very proud to be a partner of this event. Thank you very much. Dr. Dombret said before, when we met before, that he loves discussions. So if you have questions, we'll be happy to discuss them later on. We want a lively debate. I'll start out with 2-3 questions, and then I'll hand over to you. The first question that I have doesn't cover anything that's in your speech. It covers your private life. Your father was a banker just like you were, or like you are, or were. He was born in 1925, so his experience spans quite a long time. I wonder, what bank did he work for? Because I didn't find that in the internet. And the other question is, how would he view the crisis that we see today? What would be his perspective on what we see today?
Yeah, actually, we buried my father last year, and he's buried here in Berlin. So I think it's quite appropriate, that question, although I've never been asked the question. He worked at Dresdner Bank, okay. And in the old days, you had always 2 directors, one who was looking after the private clients and the other one who was looking after the corporate clients, and he was always on the corporate side. And so, like many sons, I was, I guess, impressed by my father and took the same job. When we had the 25th reunion of my Abitur, it was incredible to see how many people took the jobs of their fathers. You know, I was at a pure boys' school. I think 90%. And I'm one of them. Now, when he was a banker, and that's the difference to the time before the outbreak of the crisis. I know that 99% of his job was servicing the real economy. I remember lots of meetings when I was 10, 15 years old, and my sister was a little younger, that we had entrepreneurs at our house, that there was a lot of discussions, that he went to factories, that he, it was not a world of derivatives, it was a world of corporates and companies and real economy. That's the first. And that changed, and it changed so dramatically that that it became a factor we can talk about, that if banking is detached from its clients, you have an issue. But the second issue, second difference, he would say, I think, if he would be able to sit here, he would say that banking was much more transparent. Everybody knew his banker. You constantly talked to each other. Today you do, of course, a lot through the internet. You look for the cheapest deal. And the direct banker-client relationship is not what it used to be. And having so much interaction with bankers and clients made it also very transparent, because they lived in your community, and you talk to them, and if they misbehave, you notice, and if they change all the time, you notice, and I think these would be two things he would point out to. In the old days, not many people worked in. Everybody tried to work at the client. You know, the good jobs were where you could service clients, be it retail clients or corporate clients. If you were a relationship manager, this was probably the best job you could have, because the money was made between the client and the bank, and the relationship manager was sort of connecting them. Today, or maybe 5 years or 6 years ago, you would argue that the biggest money makers on Wall Street were people who would never see a client and sit somewhere behind computers, setting up models, who make an enormous amount of money, sometimes an insane amount of money, totally decoupled from a transaction. And that is, of course, a big difference, and I think that's what my father would say. So I'm speaking on his behalf.
When you say banking used to be servicing the real economy, do you think it's possible that can come back? That banking industry can come back and service the real economy, or is that lost forever?
That's what the regulatory environment is trying to force.
Okay.
Yeah, so that is what the Financial Stability Board, and that's what what governments, central banks, regulators have in mind. Yeah, so we're not really in the business of telling banks which business models to drive, but we can set incentives, and by that we can also set disincentives. And at the end of the day, the idea of a bank is to service the real economy. And that's why the governments have saved banks in the crisis, because they didn't want the real economy to get hurt. They didn't want a credit crunch, and through the credit crunch, everybody else getting hurt. Yeah, so the link between banks and the real economy has to be very strong.
You gave us a very strong endorsement of the European Banking Union, but you also said it's not a quick fix. So how quickly can it be achieved?
That depends on so many factors that would really not be appropriate to discuss it in 2 or 3 sentences. It depends on, for example, when the EU Commission is making final suggestions on the recovery, the resolution mechanism, etc., etc. When the European Parliament decides on that, when we find solutions to the questions are raised. So it's a process. I think we should have it as quickly as possible, but not over hastily, because this is a really interesting project of European integration, where it makes a whole lot of sense, and if we do it over hastily, we are bound to disappoint. And if we disappoint, we do more harm than we help. So that's why we should do it as soon and as quickly as possible, and it will only work if we want to do it as quickly as possible, if we do what needs to be done in a single supervisory mechanism, but still work with the national supervisors going forward. It will not be able to replace, and that in the middle of a crisis, everything, sort of replace the compass while flying. You have to make sure that what you have and what's working reasonably well, you keep, and you gradually build this up. So by fully replacing this, which is not the intention, by the way, that would not work.
When you started out with your speech, you talked about competitiveness. And one thing that I think about often is how competitive are we in a Europe of 27 member states or 17 Euro states, either way, if our decisions take so long all the time. I mean, this crisis has been around for 3 years. It took us so long to start fixing it. decision processes are so lengthy. What's your view on that part of European integration?
I tend to disagree. My former president, Axel Weber, he always used to say this crisis is like a chameleon. It comes in new colors all the time and new shapes and forms. It's still the same crisis. No, you cannot compare the banking crisis, let me call it the Lehman bank crisis of 2008 with the euro area sovereign debt crisis. These are two different issues. They have the same actors in the banks, but they are not. But the first crisis, the Lehman crisis, was a crisis coming out of a ever so wrong assumption that there's a zero-sum game and that you can pass on risk, and if you pass it on long enough, the risk disappears. And there may be no risk. This is, of course, not working. The sovereign debt crisis is a crisis where, and the asset class of the first crisis was first the subprime asset class, and then maybe the American real estate asset class, which is a big asset class. Now, the sovereign debt crisis is a much larger asset class. Here we're talking a much larger amount of money. And the result of that is that partly because of bank rescues, but that was only the icing on the cake, mostly because of structural reforms which were not taken, which were delayed, and because of an assumption that a government cannot go insolvent whatsoever, that there will always be a possibility to incur tax on people and then keep on paying interest and repaying the debt. The debt sustainability levels were called into question, and because of that, this illusion that all debt, as long as it's sovereign, is of the same quality left. I may remind you that if I have the numbers right, in 2008, for a 2-year Greek debt, you paid 7 basis points more than for German bunds, basis points. So even so there was an illusion that whether it's Greek debt or whether it's German debt or whether it's American debt, it's all the same, which of course was wrong, was a wrong assumption. So these are two distinctly different issues. They are two distinctly different asset classes, but unfortunately, the problems of the banks and who hold the debt of the sovereigns, this nexus makes this entire soup so poisonous. But if you now look to the first crisis, many things have been done. For example, in the United States, where the problems came from, the banking system. The TARP.
Well, that's the US, that's not Europe.
No, that's where it started. No, and the Trouble Asset Relief Program is repaid, and they made money on it. And the American banks have huge equity buffers now. In Europe, we have done a lot of good things with regard to bad banks. We have nationalized and put into bad banks a lot of assets. So we have made progress. The equity ratios have increased tremendously. So on the first part of this crisis, the Lehman part, we have made big progress. I think risk management systems have been changed. There's a new risk attitude. There's an awareness also by the media. The boni discussion, has changed the system of how boni and compensation is being paid, etc., etc. So there have been changes. The euro debt crisis has also changed things. We had, as I said in my little speech, in Greece, in Italy, in Spain, in Ireland, in Portugal, we had changes, structural changes, which are paying dividends now. In Ireland, we are back to a primary surplus. And I've been to Dublin last year and held a speech there, and you can see the crisis. You can feel the crisis. It's a very intense situation, but they are making very, very large and considerable progress. So if it takes 10 to 20 years for a macroeconomic imbalance to build up, how can one expect that this can be resolved in a year's time or half a year's time? This problem built up. Everybody was watching, including central banks, including the media, including the investors. The investors didn't say a single word. They were willing to accept 7 basis points more on Greece sovereign debt. So everybody didn't see the issue. And if this builds up, if a bubble like in Spain in the real estate area, if this builds up over 15 years, there were warnings by the IMF, but they were not taken seriously. It will take some time. And this time is needed. And for this time, we need to buy the time with the programs. But the programs have to be designed that growth and competitiveness returns to those countries. And so the decisions are being made in those countries. Where I would agree with you is, are we really moving very quickly in the political decision-taking process in Europe to have a deeper European integration? There, I would agree with you. There, the process is rather slow.
All right, thank you.
Sobering.
I'd like to open the debate for questions. There's one question right there, the gentleman in the red jacket. Please state your name and where you're from before you ask your question. Thank you.
I'm Samson Rogers from the ESMT MBA class. There is, of course, part of the financial services sector which still deals with the real economy. And I was thinking specifically of, say, venture capitalists and other types of investors that deal with startups, new businesses of all kinds. And of course, this is an area that, say, Europe has comparatively little of compared to the US. I mean, comparatively weak, comparatively less activity. What do you think is the role of, say, the banks or the sort of relationship between this type of this part of the financial sector and the banks and the government?
First of all, banks are, as you correctly said, banks are not banks. And if there's a criticism of banks, the issues which came up in this crisis did not harm, for example, owner-led banks. They didn't harm savings banks. They didn't harm cooperative banks. So the banks are not banks. So, you're totally right. Now, if you compare the United States or Britain with Germany or most of the European Union, you're comparing, I wouldn't say apples and oranges, but you're comparing capital-based economies with lending-based economies. We have, 2/3 of our, of our financing is done through the classical bank loan, whereas capital markets, with all the short-termism and all the advantages of capital markets, work in the United States and in Britain. So you cannot really fully compare economies. France is also more or less a lending-based model, very similar to Germany, and we are the two core countries in the European Union. So we do have venture capital, we do have private equity, but again, if there is an American or a British private equity or venture capitalist, or a venture capital firm, if they see a chance to make money, let's say in Germany, they would immediately come here. This is one of the most open economies in the world. There are no barriers for venture capitalists or private equity firms to buy in Germany. There are some exceptions. You have to go through a process if you want to buy a bank because of the risks banks pose due to the fact that they lever themselves so much and they can fall back on the taxpayers. But we have private equity companies who own 3, 4, 5 banks in Germany, quite considerable banks, and also military companies and others. You have to have a certain approval process. Otherwise, this is a fully open economy and money can flow into Germany at any time, and actually it does. It did flow into the real estate sector private money of that sort you're mentioning. But that created a little bit of bubble. I'm not talking about the residential real estate sector, but the commercial real estate sector. So I think being an open economy, everybody can invest here, and they don't do it as much as in the United States or Britain, because we are much more of a lending-based economy, and there is a relationship between the bank and the enterprises.
You just said a little bit of a real estate bubble. Could you dwell a little more on that? What exactly, how dangerous is it actually right now in this country?
It's not dangerous. We have a situation of very, very low interest rates, while at the same time we have a very high amount of liquidity. Now that's the situation we are facing. While safe assets, which in the past were considered sovereign bonds, for sure the Bund is still a safe haven, yield very little, while savings account yield very little, etc., etc., etc. So there is, in a situation like that, there is a certain search for yield, Germany has seen around about 10 years of a sideward movement in terms of residential property prices. And since it has now started to move, maybe 2-3 years ago, and we have seen now 2 years of growth, not overall in Germany, but we see moderate growth on a nationwide level of between 2 and 3% per annum. But we see more growth, higher price growth in the large cities. And
Berlin, for instance.
For Berlin, of course. And we see it also we look at a sample of 125 cities, mostly the cities above 50,000 inhabitants, and you also see it there. And it started only in the new developments, and it has sort of shifted towards the older buildings, resold flats. It has started to do a knock-on effect. In the 125 largest cities in Germany, we have seen an increase in residential real estate prices by 5.3% last year and by 5.4% in 2011. So you're 11% ahead. For 2 years, that's not bad. It's much better than you get on a savings account, for example. Yeah, that's not. And in the larger cities, you've seen, I don't have the numbers right now with me, increases of 7 to 8% per year. And as we all know, in the city of Berlin, there are some parts where there is no increase whatsoever, and others where the increase is even higher. So it's not even balanced in the city of Berlin. Now, but why? So we do have movement in the residential real estate market. But why isn't this not a problem? For 2 reasons, not yet a problem. It is to have a bubble, you need extensive, if not to say excessive credit growth. The credit volume is not growing in Germany for real estate. Now, real estate is a very, very large animal. Real estate, exposure to real estate is 2/3 of the entire credit exposure of the private households in Germany, and it's 40% of the entire loan exposure of the entire banking industry. 40%. 50% for savings banks, 50% for cooperative banks. Big tanker. Right. Yeah, but the loan volume is not growing. The second thing one would look at is how are the loan-to-value ratios? Are they decreasing? They're not. Okay. People are even putting more equity into loan deals. So the credit standards are not decreasing, and the loan volume is not rising. Nevertheless, we thought it important enough not to express a warning in November, but to give a certain, raise a certain sensitivity to the issue. Because, of course, sectorally and locally, it can become a problem. Yeah? Don't forget that last year we had wage increases. After a long time of no wage increases, we did, and that is, renters were also able to accept higher rents as usual. So we are still in an equilibrium, but we are watching this very closely.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, any more questions from your? I'll take this gentleman first, and I'll move over to this side.
My name is Sören Radde from DRW Berlin. Dr. Dombret, you talked about the time it would take to unwind the bubble and the crisis effects, etc. And in particular, you talked about the careful approach to creating a banking union and the time that would take in order to eventually decouple sovereign and banking risks. Now, in light of the fact that this is a lengthy process, do you see any credible alternative to the ECB stabilizing sovereign debt markets through their securities markets program in the meanwhile?
It's a very good question, but as we're having ECB council meetings all the time these days, I'm not allowed and I will not comment on monetary policy.
All right, the gentleman with the tie right there. Well, there's a lot of gentlemen with ties around, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Guillermo Vaquero, a professor here at ESMT. You had mentioned these risk differences between sovereigns, and one mechanism that is actively being discussed as a solution to the sovereign crisis in Europe is the Eurobond. That is probably something that will entail a lot of trade-offs within Europe, but it may have also important consequences for European competitiveness. So what is your view on Eurobonds, if you can elaborate further on this? Thank you.
I can comment on that. So, and I will. Thanks for that question. Now, I think that in the euro area we have two options. Option number one, to make it simple, is that we look at what went wrong in this crisis, go back to the Maastricht Treaty, and repair what we see is wrong in the Maastricht Treaty. To give you one example, according to the Stability and Growth Pact, which is of course the main element of the Maastricht Treaty, if there is a breach, let's say, of the deficit hurdle, you would have a process in place which could end up in a sanction, for example, if a country breaches that hurdle. But the way it works is that the 17 countries vote whether or not that was a breach of this or not. And as we have now so many countries taking rather than giving, we are living a little bit in a world of I scratch your back, you scratch my back, and never ever has any sanction been declared, although we know there have been many breaches. Now, for example, in my example, one would have an automatic sanction, not a vote on that. So the first option is you see what went wrong, how can you make it better, how can you make good on that. The second option is you overcome this discrepancy or this mismatch between a centralized monetary policy through the ECB and a national fiscal policy, which is done in the member states, and you put the fiscal policy on the level of the euro area. You overcome this mismatch. You go into European integration. Then you wouldn't have that mismatch of a centralized monetary policy and a decentralized fiscal policy, and there would be no problem. A Eurobond can only be consistent in option number two. If you go to a European integration, a Eurobond is the most logical thing to have. But if I listen to all the meetings of the heads of governments and states, there have been no decision for any country being willing to hand over its fiscal sovereignty to the euro area. Everybody wants to stay separate. So we are in option 1, we're not in option 2. As long as we are in option 1, we cannot afford to have a Eurobond. If I say we, I don't mean the central banks. If the politicians decide, this is not a central banking decision, if the politicians decide, we want to mutualize debt, we want to create a fiscal union or even a political union in Europe, a Eurobond is the logical instrument to have.
All right, unfortunately, this discussion is coming to a close. I want to thank you for coming, for sharing your thoughts. And obviously, I want to thank our distinguished speaker for coming here, even with a vicious Russian cold. I hope you get better soon, and thanks for being here. You all have a nice day. And read the Tagesspiegel, of course.